Hello, today I have the pleasure of speaking with Professor Massimo Pigliucci, a renowned author, podcaster, and KD Irani Professor of Philosophy at the City College of New York. Massimo's extensive background in evolutionary biology, philosophy of science, and practical philosophy uniquely positions him to offer deep insights into what it means to lead a meaningful life. As the author of How to Be a Stoic in Quest for Character, his work has guided countless readers through ancient philosophies, practical applications, bringing timeless wisdom to our modern world. Professor Massimo, thank you for the impactful work you do.
A pleasure. Thanks for having me.
You bet. So just to give my viewers and the parents just a little background, you have a PhD in genetics, PhD in biology, and a PhD in philosophy of science.
That's correct.
All right. Well, that's a lot of degrees.
Yeah, I know. It took me some time to learn.
Yeah, of course, of course. Okay. Now, also, just to give my viewers something, the reason why I'm choosing your book to incorporate into Pax Academia High School, The Quest for Character, is because of the addressing societal values that we need to attack. Right? We need to have character development, but in America, there's so much focus on wealth and chasing titles and vanity and with social media and looking a certain way to, and not really questioning things we should be questioning. And we leave the soul and the character behind. Right. But your book, I believe, really addresses that. And that's the reason why I'm choosing to incorporate your work into the school.
Sounds good to me.
yeah, I think it's important. So, okay, so on my first question is, before, let's say you're a professor, I'm a teacher, and we haven't read the book yet. We haven't read anything about virtue. What kind of responses do you think people, or my students, or anybody for that matter, could we expect if we ask the question, can virtue be taught? What reasoning do you think they would employ in their beliefs?
Yeah, that's a good question. So as you know, the issue of whether virtue can be taught, it's actually an old debate. Goes back at least to Socrates and the pre-Socratics, so at least 2,400 years ago. And there are definitely different opinions. In fact, even Socrates himself was of two minds, depending on which dialogue by Plato you look at it. In some cases, Socrates seems to be pretty skeptical of the notion you can teach virtue. And in others, he seems more convinced. Of course, that's exactly what he's doing in the Socratic dialogues. He's teaching virtue. But so it would be a little bit strange if he really thought that it couldn't be done. I think a lot of the discussion here hinges on A, what exactly do we mean by virtue?
Yeah, exactly.
And B, what exactly do we need by teaching, which may sound like a strange thing to say, but there are different ways of teaching things, right? So it's one, for instance, let's say that I want to teach fundamental physics, then I probably would spend a significant amount of time on the theory, lecturing, having maybe discussions with the students, etc., before we get to any practical application, right? You have to understand quite a bit of the theoretical background. But if I were to teach, let's say, how to ride a bicycle, right, I'm not going to give you a lot of theory. I might just give you a little bit of an explanation of what a bicycle is if you've never seen one before and how it works, but that will take a few minutes. Most of the teaching would actually be practice, right? You get on a bicycle and then I'd say, okay, you hold the handlebar this way and you start paddling and all that sort of stuff.
Exactly.
So that's relevant to the teaching of virtue, because virtue, of course, is a character trait. It's a predisposition. It's a behavioral predisposition. To be virtuous means that, other things being equal, somebody tends to behave in a certain way. For instance, one of the classical virtues is, of course, generosity, right? Or when would you say that somebody is generous? Not when he gives you a lecture on what generosity is and how it works, but when he actually behaves generously, right? So he lends his time to people, to friends, for instance, that are in need, or he lends his money, he gives his money to people that need it, or otherwise essentially sacrifices some of his own resources in order to help others. That's a generous person, right?
Sure.
In fact, that person may even have a very sketchy sort of theoretical or philosophical understanding of what generosity is, but so long as he behaves generously, then we say that he is actually virtuous. So the ancient Greco-Romans, Socrates, Plato, the Stoics, they thought that in order to teach and understand virtue, you really need, however, a combination of both of those things. You need some kind of understanding of what it is that you're doing, or what it is that you're supposed to be doing. That's the theory part, let's say. So that's the philosophy part. And then you need to practice. You need a lot of actual practice in the field. And the more you do it, the more you get into the habit, as Aristotle would say, of acting generously or acting courageously, and so on and so forth, right? And so you can teach virtue, but that teaching takes the form of a combination of theory and practice, where the practice is far more outweighs the theory. That you don't need a lot of theory, but you do need a lot of practice.
Yeah. So and that's a lot of people, I would say, it's hard to find both, I guess, because I think both are important, and it's hard to even practice what you're going to do yourself, and I know sometimes I even have that issue, so it's a human thing that we all need to work on, and I think it's a great, especially generosity. And just to give a personal example is my father is a very generous person, and he never expects anything in return. He just gives. Just like he doesn't give loans out, right? He just gives. He says, I expect something in return. And that's something I find to be generous, not just something where you give out something for the sake of giving it, but then you expect something in return.
Right. And in fact, that's kind of part of the definition of generosity, right? You don't expect a return.
Yeah.
Because if you do expect a return, then you're not being generous. Then it becomes a transaction.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Then it becomes, and there's nothing wrong with transactions per se.
Right.
But if I say, look, I'm going to give you some money because you're in need, but then, you need to give it back to me next year or whatever it is.
Right.
Nothing wrong with that transaction, but it's not generosity.
Right. Yeah.
Obviously. Right. Yeah. It is a different kind of arrangement. Part of the issue that I know people have sometimes trouble with is, well, okay, but what does it mean to practice? Right. So how do I understand? People have usually not much trouble understanding what it means to study the sort of the theory of something, right? So, okay, fine. If we're going to talk about, let's stick with the example of generosity for a minute. If we're talking about generosity from a philosophical perspective, we might start discussing about what generosity actually is, what kind of examples, instances count as generosity, which ones don't, and so on and so forth. But then when you say, okay, and then now you go out there and practice, what does that mean exactly? And the ancients, particularly the Stoics, were actually very clear about what that means. If you decide that you want to be generous, more generous, you say, you look at yourself and you say, you know what, I could improve in the realm of generosity. I need to work on being generous. Then what you do is you start making a list of things that you need to do because they are, in fact, generous actions. So, for instance, you might sit down and say, you know what, from now on, when I get out of my apartment or my house, I'm going to put some change in my pockets, and the first person that looks like they need it, I'm just going to give it to them, period.
Sure.
No questions asked. Now, is that generosity? Well, yes and no, right? It's a generous behavior, for sure. Internally, however, you might not feel yet like a generous person. You might say, well, but this is just me making a conscious decision. Because I don't really feel like doing it. I don't have that kind of attitude. I just made a conscious decision. And in a sense, I'm kind of forcing myself to do it. That's fine. That's how you begin to practice. It's very similar to, how do you practice, for instance, how you get yourself into exercising regularly, let's say, right? Well, the first thing, you might not feel like it. You might not, you might not really enjoy going to the gym, but you sign up. The first thing you do, you sign up, and then you tell yourself, okay, now I'm going to force myself, 3 times a week, an hour and a half or whatever it is, I'm going to do it. Initially, you will not feel like doing it. It will feel a drag. It will feel like, oh gosh, I have to go again to the gym.
Yeah.
But you decided to do it. And now if you stick to that program, little by little, it will become less of a drag. And in fact, eventually, you might even get to enjoy it. You might even start looking forward to going to the gym because, as Aristotle said, you got yourself into developing a habit.
Right.
And that's how you develop habits. You first make a conscious decision to overcome whatever resistance you might have, or even whatever sort of passivity you might have. And then once you start actually doing it, it gets easier and easier, just like with everything else.
And there's rewards to it. I mean,
of course.
Yeah.
There is rewards. Now, the Stoics would say you don't do it for the reward, of course, again. But it does come with a reward. That's right, because you feel good about it. Right. Yeah. It's very similar to going to the gym. If you start going on a regular basis, you actually will feel good.
Right.
At the end of the session, you will feel both psychologically good because you accomplished something, and physically good because you've done exercise, and we know that stimulates the release of endorphins, for instance. Right. the pleasure drug of the brain, et cetera, et cetera. Now, that's not the reason you do it. You don't do it in order to feel the endorphins. You do it because you think that it's good for your physical health, for your fitness. Right. But it's a bonus that you also feel good about it, right?
Right. And it also incorporates who you are as a person. I mean, the discipline,
yes.
It becomes climate rather than weather, it doesn't change.
Correct. That's right. Yep.
Yeah. Okay, I want to move to a really intriguing concept in your book, the idea of arete.
Yeah.
Yeah, in philosophy, which refers to excellence or virtue, and how can we reach our highest potential and purpose in life? How can we, what can we do to reach that function in our life to make it purpose, to give us some purpose to it? And I just think that's because I personally have never really heard that word before, but how might understanding this concept better benefit us individually, contribute to a healthier society as a whole? So not just personally, but also if everybody does it, or at least you teach people to do it. What's that going to do for society as a whole, do you think? Healthier, health-wise?
So let's first start with what exactly arete is. Often it is translated as virtue. And so arete, it's often referred to as the original Greek word that means virtue. But that's not quite right. In fact, it's the concept is much of arete. It's much broader than the concept of virtue. Virtue is a little bit of a old-fashioned word these days, right? So it's if you say to somebody, "Oh, you want to be virtuous," it's almost like, what are you talking about? You say that I should abstain from sex or something like that, right. Or be pure or whatever. Like, no, that's not what virtue is about. Virtue, the 4 cardinal virtues that were advocated by Plato and the Stoics, for instance, are the virtues of wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance. Right. So where wisdom is the knowledge of what is good and what is bad, so that you can act in the world appropriately. Courage is the courage to do the right thing. Justice is the knowledge of what justice is, and the behavior, behaving justly, fairly toward the people. And then temperance is the notion that you do things in right measure, right? Neither too much nor too little. That's the kind of virtue we're talking about. But arete is an even broader concept. The actual translation, the most clear, correct translation of the word is excellence. Yeah. So to be arete, or to strive for arete, means to strive to be the best that you can be at whatever task we're considering. And in fact, the term arete doesn't apply just to human beings. It applies to everything, including inanimate objects. In my book, I bring up the example of, suppose that I go out because I need to purchase a bread knife, right? Because, I need a bread knife. Well, I want an arete bread knife. meaning a bread knife that really does well what it's supposed to do, which is cutting bread, without slipping, without the possibility that I cut my fingers instead of the bread, that's so on and so forth. A knife that does very well the function of a knife is an arete knife. It's an excellent knife, right? Now that raises the question of, well, okay, if that's the definition of arete, then what does it mean to be arete for a human being? What is the function of a human being? Because I just explained arete in terms of function. Now it's easy to understand that the function of a bread knife is to cut bread, but what exactly is the function of a human being, right? And there, the ancients, especially the Stoics, had an interesting idea. They thought, like, okay, if we're talking about the function of a human being, ask yourself what kind of living organism humans are. That is, in other words, ask yourself about human nature. Right? And they thought, well, human beings are animals, right? So they need a certain number of things, just like every other animal. We eat, we have to drink, we need shelter, all that sort of stuff, right? But that we have in common with other animals, so that's not particularly special. We are supposed to do that stuff because otherwise we don't live, but it's not specifically human. The two things that especially the Stoics thought are specifically humans are the ability to use our intelligence to solve problems, right? So reason, in other words. Other animals are certainly intelligent, but no other species uses reason in the way in which we do. No other species has the kind of high level of cognition, and no other species uses reason as their major survival weapon, basically, right? So we don't have other things that other animals have. We don't fly, we don't swim fast, we don't have big muscles, we don't run very fast, but we do have a large brain, much larger than anything else compared to our body size. So that's one thing. We are reasoning animals. And two, we are highly social. In fact, modern biologists would say that human beings are obligatorily social. That is, we have to be social, otherwise we don't survive. We can, under very unusual circumstances, individuals stranded on, let's say, a deserted island might survive for a little bit, but human beings just don't do well unless they function in a social group.
Does that mean socially, as in, because I know that we conglomerate and make towns and cities and stuff so we can survive on a physical level, so we can help each other out. Is that when it comes to social, are we saying that that's in order for us to be nurtured with each other, we have to have that? Otherwise, if we're out living in the woods someplace,
right, we have to have a social group. How large that social group is, it's actually a matter of historical accident. Very early on in human history, our social groups were very small. During the Pleistocene, during most of human history, we lived in small bands of the estimate is between 80 to 100, 120 individuals. So that's very small. Then after the agricultural revolution, after the invention of agriculture about 10,000 years ago, we started settling down. We moved from living like hunter-gatherers, and, always going around, to settling down and starting. Our population size started increasing. We started building villages, and then cities, and then eventually nation states. So the size of the group has definitely gone up dramatically over the last few thousand years. But nevertheless, the point is, we just don't do well unless we live in a social group.
Right. Okay.
So the ancients look at these two things and say, okay, so those are the functions of a human being: to live socially and to use reason in order to solve problems. Right. And so what does it mean then to be arete or excellent for a human being? It means to be pro-social, that is, to cooperate with other people, to interact well with other, in a positive fashion with other people, and to use their brain in order to solve problems. So then to be virtuous, if we equate now arete with virtue, to be virtuous means first and foremost to reason well and to act pro-socially. Right.
Okay. No, that's that's good. A lot of people, there's there's always this big thing with hanging out with the right people as opposed to just hanging out with people.
Yep.
You know what I mean? And that's where I think a lot of this comes from your book, is that how do we be the right people so other people can be the right people? You know, we can
That's
kind
right.
of spread that out. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, that's right. There was a one of the major Stoic philosophers, Epictetus, who lived in near the end of the first century and the early beginning of the second century. He actually drove this point home with his students. He said,
Mhm.
you know, be careful what kind of company you keep.
Right. Yeah.
Because the company you keep will affect your character. It will affect, and therefore, your arete, your virtue. So you need to hang around people that are going to help you becoming a better person. You don't want to hang around people that are going to drag you down. Now, that may sound a little bit elitist, but in fact, it's the same kind of advice probably that your parents gave you when you were a kid, right? It's like, be careful who you hang around with, because some people are not a good influence on you, and other people are better. They help you to grow, and they help you to become a better human being.
Exactly. Yeah. And I've given this that same conversation with homeschooling, for example. A lot of the parents or just people generally speaking says homeschooling is not good because they don't get the socialization. But I always have to ask, well, what kind of socialization do you want?
Yeah, that's right.
You know, I mean, if you go into the public schools or anywhere, and there's things going on that are not going to be a positive influence, is that really the socialization that we want for our children?
Yeah, you need to ask yourself as a parent who you want your kids to socialize, and the answer may not be that straightforward, right? I mean, it's for one thing, because parents have a different perspective, of course, compared to the kids. They, in a sense, they know better, but only up to a point, because of course the new generation has different kind of perspective and different kinds of needs. So it's not quite as simple a question to answer, but it certainly is a question one wants to raise. What do I? And it's not just for kids; it's for adults as well. There is actually very good research in social psychology that shows, for instance, that people influence dramatically their circle of friends. If you start all of a sudden, for instance, if you start smoking, there is a 50% chance, 50, that's pretty high, 50% chance that your closest friends will also start smoking. And conversely, if you quit smoking, there is about the same percentage, same chances that your friends are also going to quit smoking. So you do have, we don't realize it necessarily, but we do have a big responsibility in terms of who we, even as adults, hang around with, because people have a large effect on us, and we have a large effect on other people.
Of course, yeah. That actually brings me to the next question is, given the society that we live in, like I had mentioned earlier, you know, it's materialistic, and it's very important. You know, we always hammer in high school, we got to go off to college, you got to go get a good job, and you know, all that, which is true. I would never argue with that. But sometimes we leave the soul behind and the character behind to do that. But do you think is it unrealistic to expect such openness in a culture like ours, like as far as the red day and people going out and trying to enrich their own personal being, when we have all these distractions going on? I mean, it's hard to get off the phone, you know, with social media. Seems like people are addicted to that. And there's a lot of pressure to be this way, pressure to be that way. When we talk to strangers, we just get to know each other. One of the first questions, it seems anyway, at least with me, at least to me, and all that is, so what do you do for work? Rather than, are you married? Are you a father? Are you you know, are you a friend? How many, you know, what's your friends? And I mean, there's really no relationships that are in that question. It's just more, what do you do? And I think that's very telling. And so I'm just wondering, with all this distractions that we live among, is it unrealistic or realistic to expect this kind of openness?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I didn't grow up in the United States. I grew up in Italy, and in Italy there is not even a phrase to ask, you know, what do you do? It's just not part of the language.
Yeah.
I mean, if you really want, you can ask, but it's not the kind of thing that people ask. Certainly not to strangers, or not to the first time that you're introduced to somebody.
Sure,
eventually it might come up in conversation, but it's not a defining characteristic. Typically in European countries, that's not what you ask people, and it is very telling that on the other hand, it is. You're right. Usually the first question that people ask when they introduce to somebody, oh, so my name is so and so. Oh, okay. What do you do?
Yeah. Okay.
Now, in terms of realism or not, well, it's certainly going to be difficult to teach arete, to teach virtue to people, especially to the current generation that, as you say, it tends to be distracted by a lot of social media, new gadgets, with short attention span, all sorts of stuff that it's going on. People don't read books anymore. By and large, why? Well, because books are long, so it takes concentration. It takes time, and most people are into TikTok and stuff like that, things that last for 30 seconds, and that seems to be the average attention span. So it certainly is a challenge to teach virtue, to teach character, to improve from that perspective. But I think that's why it's even more important to do it. Right.
Yeah.
It's the Greco-Roman approach is really a counter, and I think a much needed counter to our modern society that is too distracted and it is too consumerist. Here's another phrase that is specifically American. It tells you a lot about American culture, and that's the notion of shopping therapy. Right. So, your retail therapy. So you're stressed out. You're depressed. Go out and shop. It's like, what?
Substituting? Yeah.
What are you talking about? That's not the problem. The problem is not that I don't have enough stuff. The problem is that I'm unhappy with my life, probably because I have too much stuff and I don't know what to do with it. Right. And it doesn't actually fulfill that kind of that void that I'm dealing with. So although those are all things that a revival of Greco-Roman culture and attitude, properly updated, of course, to the 21st century. I mean, we don't want to literally go back to, 5th century BC Greece or 2nd century Rome. Those were societies that, just like ours, had their own problems, and we don't necessarily want, we don't want to. One of the risks about studying and reading about the ancients is then to the tendency that some people have to sort of glorify them, right? It's like, oh, the good old times of ancient Rome. Hold on a second. Ancient Rome had slavery for one thing.
Right.
Brutal. There was, it was a brutal society. Yes, of course, the few privileged ones had a great life, but that's true even today. The few privileged ones always have a good life, but the majority of the masses did not. In fact, interestingly, some economists have suggested that in modern United States, the degree of disparity, of inequality in terms of wealth is about as large as it was during the Roman Empire, which tells you something. And so we don't want to go back there literally. What we want to do is, the reasonable thing to do is to take the best of what other cultures and previous times had come up with and discard the worst, right?
Right.
And it turns out that gladiatorial games and slavery was definitely among the worst, but the notion of virtue and character and the fact that the idea that you shouldn't be wasting your life accumulating stuff that you don't need, those are actually good, and so we want to retain those ideas. In a sense, one of the reasons it's interesting and learning experience to read the ancients is because they had pretty much the same problems that we do. If you read Seneca, for instance, one of the ancient Stoics, he complains about all sorts of stuff. He complains about people, making their entire life about their career and then being dissatisfied about it, right? He complains about people wanting to accumulate more and more money and more wealth and then being unhappy about their lives. He complains even about the fact that he can't get any writing done because there is a lot of noise coming out from the street, and he has to move because he can't focus. So we can relate to all of those things. And that is why reading the ancient Greco-Romans is actually a useful thing, because you realize all of a sudden that these are the same kind of people, these are your neighbors. Even though they lived 2,000 years ago, these are very much the same kind of human beings that we find today, and they have the same kind of problems.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, there's three categories that you outline as far as knowledge is concerned. There's the mastery of it, awareness of ignorance, and unawareness of ignorance. Often those unaware of their ignorance display the highest confidence, which they tend to be the noisiest, right? The ones.
Yep. Yes.
Is there, as educators, how can we guide students to cultivate both the confidence necessary to seek knowledge and the humility to recognize the limits of what they know? So, I mean, it seems like we live in a way where we're too afraid to admit that we don't know something. I guess maybe we think we're going to be called stupid. Maybe we're going to be looked down upon, or whatever the case is. We tend to frown on saying, I don't know.
Right. Yeah, that's correct. I think one of the insights from the ancients, again, in particular the Stoics, is that we just should care less about what other people say or think, right? So I'm afraid of doing this, or I'm afraid of saying this because who knows what other people are going to say. And Epictetus, who was one of the ancient Stoics, as I mentioned earlier, would say, so what do you care what other people think? The only thing that it's important about what other people think is whether they may actually be right in making a suggestion, right? So it's possible that somebody is going to give you advice that it's actually valuable, but that's up to you to determine. Right. So you hear a criticism, let's say, or some kind of advice, then it's always up to you to say, yeah, that sounds about right, so I'm going to do it, or no, that doesn't. That seems like crap. I'm not going to do it. Ultimately, I think one way to gain confidence is, in fact, to internalize the notion that it doesn't really matter that much what other people think, especially on social media. Because if you think about it, it's one thing if you're talking to your friends or your colleagues or your relatives, right? Those are people that matter to you because you interact with them on a regular basis. You have ongoing relationships with them. So, I would say if your brother or your father or your friend or even your colleague says something, you should pay attention. It's that doesn't mean you should agree with them, but you should pay attention.
Right.
But if some stranger says something on Facebook, TikTok, X, or whatever, it's like, why do you care? Why? Who are these people?
That reminds me that, like, I've seen Facebook. People who have over 1,000 friends, and it's like, there's no way you talk to this many people.
No, that's right.
There's just no way you have that close a relationship with that many.
They're definitely not friends. I mean, it's simply a marketing ploy on the part of Facebook to call those friends. They're not your friends. Most of them are people you don't know. You probably never even met in person, and you don't know who they are, what they think, how they be. You don't even know whether they're people these days.
Oh, that's true.
They could be bots. They could be AI bots.
Yeah, no, that's a good point.
And there are stories of people engaging in conversations, and then it turns out that the other side conversing was actually a bot, and so you're literally wasting your time talking to nobody. So, look, there is research at this point in social psychology that clearly shows that social media overall are a net negative, a net detriment to society. The problem, of course, is not the technology per se. The technology is inherently somewhat neutral. You can do good things with it and you can do bad things. When I was on Facebook, for instance, most of my friends, so to speak, were actual friends. Were people who don't live necessarily in the same town that I live, but I met in the past. We were friends in the past, and I wanted to keep, tab on them, and as well as my relatives. Most of the people were those. I didn't have any strangers or very few strangers. So that's a good use of the technology, right? That's a way to keep in touch and to keep human relations going, even though you may be separated by hundreds or thousands of kilometers of space.
Correct.
But unfortunately, the way the technology has evolved, it's mostly deleterious. So there is now research that shows that, by and large, spending time on social media, it's a waste of your life.
It
and
is.
so one of the things that I would suggest is just to get off it entirely.
Yeah.
I got off it entirely.
Going to have withdrawal effects, but that's how it goes.
That's right. That's
right. I was one of the things I really like, though, as far as incorporating this in high school, and the reason is like, why don't we incorporate something like this in college or some? Well, I think this is important in high school because high schoolers, most of them, with the exception of the seniors, can't really vote yet. They have to be 18. So why teach them to be skeptics? Why teach them to question leaders if they can't even vote anyway? But that's why you should, is because they're at least going to start understanding what questions do they need to ask leaders. That's practice. That's something you got to practice, I think. It's not something you just come up at the top of your head. There has to be some systematic way of doing that, which Socrates, I believe, lays out quite well. And so I think it's a good idea now to teach ninth grade all the way up as far as how to question your leaders, how to determine if they are trustworthy or they're just falling in the latter or the first category, where they're leaders who think they know things but they really don't. How can we teach them how to pick that out, because there's a lot of them.
Yeah. No, that's right. There is a lot of them, and the time window to teach critical thinking, to teach virtue, and all that sort of stuff is actually the age, the so-called what the Greco-Romans call the age of reason, which starts around 7 or 8 years old, and then it goes. Modern neuroscience tells us it goes up until the early 20s. That is the period. So what happens in that bracket is the following. Around 7 years old, more or less, give or take, kids really begin to understand abstract concepts. They're able to handle abstract things like the notion of freedom, of democracy, or something like character, or something like that. Before that, it's too early. They hear the word, but they don't really have a grasp of what's going on there. So that's why you start around 7, again, give or take a year. That depends on individual development. At the other end, we know that from modern neuroscience that the human brain stops developing, basically settles down in the early 20s. It happens earlier for women, and then a little later, a year or two later for men. After that, you can still influence people. People can still learn. People can still partially rewire sort of their connections, but it's much more difficult.
Sure.
People's views of the world are pretty much set in that framework that I'm talking about, 7 to about 20, 21, 22 years old, which is why our education at the levels of junior high school, and college is so important.
Right.
Because that is when people are receptive to new ideas, they're receptive to different ways of looking at things, et cetera, et cetera. After that, it becomes an uphill battle. If you want to convince an adult to significantly change the way they look at the world, again, it can happen, but it's rare.
It's much harder.
It takes a lot of effort.
And if they start, do you think if they start early to practice how to change their mindset, that'll last throughout, even when they are adults?
That is a good question, and it's an empirical question, and I don't know that there is a lot of evidence one way or the other. I would think so, meaning that if you make a habit of doubting things, of practicing reasonable skepticism, or practicing critical thinking, then yes, it becomes becomes a habit, just like everything else, and so it's easier, right? But it's an empirical question, and I am not aware of significant studies in that department.
Oh, okay. I mean, it would just, but you're right. I think it would make sense. But I don't know if we have any conclusive evidence or anything. But so is there any kind of qualities that we could look for in someone that may appear knowledgeable or trustworthy, even if they're not? Is there some common theme that happens in people that are like that?
That's a good question. So there is a whole area of philosophy and psychology actually that deal with trust.
Mm-hmm.
And how do we determine if we can trust somebody, right? And look, to some extent, this is commonsensical,